The sharp, cracking sound of rifle fire shattered the frozen stillness of the forest. Snow, undisturbed for days, burst into clouds as bullets struck the ground, splintering trees and kicking up icy debris. The morning sunlight, faint and pale, barely penetrated the thick canopy of pines, casting a ghostly gray over the chaos. Shadows danced erratically with every flash of gunfire, making the forest feel alive, as though it too recoiled from the violence. A group of soldiers in British uniforms scrambled for cover, their breaths coming in short, desperate bursts that mingled with the cold. Their boots crunched loudly on the snow as they darted between trees and boulders, throwing themselves behind whatever protection they could find. The enemy had the high ground, a German patrol entrenched on a ridge, raining relentless fire down upon them. The forest, vast and unyielding, offered no sanctuary, only exposed flanks and the grim reality of their dwindling options. The leader of the group crouched low behind a jagged boulder, its surface slick with ice. His breath came in measured bursts, fogging the air as he steadied himself. His gloved hands gripped his rifle tightly, the knuckles white beneath the leather. He barked orders in clipped English, his voice carrying the tone of command that offered a faint beacon of control amid the chaos. The men responded with precision, firing back in sporadic bursts, but it was clear to all of them that their position was untenable. The Germans held the ridge, and every shot they fired felt like another nail in the coffin. A young soldier beside him, no older than 20, let out a strained cry as a bullet tore through the tree trunk he was using for cover. Splinters rained down on his helmet and his wide eyes darted to the leader.
"We're pinned down, sir!"
he shouted, his voice shaking. The leader's jaw tightened, his mind racing. He didn't need the reminder, they were outgunned and outmaneuvered. Their only chance of survival was to break away, but the Germans' positioning made even retreat seem like a death sentence. Through the chaos, the leader's gaze darted to the tree line to their left. At first, it was just a flicker of movement, barely noticeable against the swirling snow. Then he saw it again. Several shadows advancing silently through the dense underbrush. His stomach twisted in realization. Another German unit was flanking them. The figures moved with practiced ease, their gray uniforms unmistakable even in the storm's poor visibility. Their approach was precise, deliberate, like a predator closing in for the kill. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The men in British uniforms froze, their gazes locked on the advancing figures. The realization spread like wildfire. They were surrounded. The enemy had outmaneuvered them completely, and with the Germans cutting off their escape, there was no way out.
"Sir, we've got movement on our left flank. More of them."
The sergeant hissed from behind a tree, his face pale.
"I see it."
The leader replied tersely, his voice barely audible. He clenched his jaw, calculating their odds. They were bad, worse than bad. He could feel the weight of the sergeant's unspoken question. What do we do now? But there was no answer that didn't end in bloodshed. And then, something unexpected happened. The flanking Germans stopped just shy of the ridge. Their leader, a tall figure with broad shoulders and a commanding presence, raised his hand in a silent signal. The soldiers under his command halted immediately, their movements synchronized with precision. For a fleeting moment, silence fell over the battlefield, save for the distant crackle of the entrenched Germans' rifle fire. Then the tall figure dropped his hand and chaos resumed, but not in the way anyone had expected. The flanking Germans raised their rifles, not toward the British uniforms below, but toward the entrenched German patrol on the ridge. The forest erupted once again, the deafening crack of rifle fire splitting the silence. But this time the bullets weren't aimed at the British soldiers. The new arrivals fired methodically, targeting the German patrol with deadly accuracy. Their sharp, disciplined shots tore through the entrenched enemy ranks, throwing them into disarray. The attackers faltered, their cohesion shattered by the betrayal from their own side. The man leading the British group exchanged a bewildered glance with his sergeant.
"What the hell?"
The sergeant began, his voice trailing off as his eyes widened in disbelief. The newcomers moved with precision, their every step calculated. Within moments, the entrenched Germans were routed. Some fell where they stood, their bodies crumpling into the snow, while others scrambled to retreat into the trees, their discipline broken. The clearing fell eerily silent, save for the soft rustle of the wind and the faint echoes of retreating footsteps. The leader of the British group rose cautiously from behind his cover, motioning for his men to hold their positions. His eyes fixed on the second group of Germans, who now stood at the edge of the ridge, their rifles lowered but their postures tense. The air between them was thick with uncertainty and unease. He stepped forward slowly, his rifle slung over his shoulder in a gesture of wary neutrality. His men followed suit, emerging from their positions, but keeping their weapons close, their eyes darting nervously between the newcomers. One of the Germans, their apparent leader, stepped forward to meet him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform impeccably kept despite the harsh conditions. His expression was calm, his eyes sharp and assessing, as though he were weighing every detail of the scene before him.
Everything all right over there?
The German asked, his English laced with a heavy accent. His voice was steady, unhurried, but there was a faint edge to it, a tension that mirrored the moment. The British leader hesitated, his gaze darting between the German and his men.
Well, surprisingly, thanks to you.
He replied cautiously, his words clipped, his tone carefully neutral. A faint smile tugged at the corners of the German's mouth.
How do you say in English? Desperate times call for desperate measures, yes?
The two men stood in silence for a moment, the snow falling softly around them. Behind them, their respective groups watched with bated breath, the tension palpable in the frigid air. Finally, the British leader inclined his head slightly.
We owe you our lives.
The German dismissed the gratitude with a wave of his hand.
Nonsense.
The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The two men continued to watch each other, each assessing, each searching for answers they couldn't yet voice. The forest, vast and indifferent, loomed around them, a silent witness to this uneasy alliance.
Where are you headed?
The German asked suddenly, breaking the silence. The British officer's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening.
I could ask you the same now, couldn't I, mate?
The German smiled faintly again, a ghost of a smirk that hinted at something deeper. Amusement, perhaps, or calculation.
Fair enough. Perhaps it's better if we part ways here.
Yes, perhaps.
The British officer replied. His hand rested lightly on the strap of his rifle, his body still, his every muscle taut with caution. The two men exchanged a final measured glance before turning away. The Germans began to retreat back into the forest, their movements as silent and deliberate as their arrival. The British soldiers remained still, their weapons at the ready, their eyes following the retreating figures until they vanished into the trees. As the last of the Germans disappeared from sight, the sergeant approached his captain, his brow furrowed.
What do you make of that, sir?
The captain didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on the empty ridge, his thoughts racing, trying to piece together the events that had just unfolded. Finally, he shook his head.
I don't know, but we need to move. Now.